This is Taoism with Ian Felton. I'm Ian Felton, a psychotherapist and practicing Taoist in Minneapolis, Minnesota. While over time, what Tao is, the meaning of Tao, Daodejing, it's all been obscured in many, many ways. And this podcast is intended to not reinterpret or reinvent Tao or transform it into some convenient modern understanding, but rather to uncover Tao where it arose. And where did it arise? It arose in ancient China. This would have been in the centuries BC, 400, 500, 600 BC. We know the texts had begun being written down. But before that, Tao was aligned with through practices, physical practices, using the body, using the breath. And what you know that millennia later, modern psychotherapy is now using these same practices to help people find psychological well-being, repackaging it, if you will. But it wasn't invented in modern times. It was invented millennia ago. Some of the first texts that were written were called the Neiye, which is inner work. And these are some basic breaths that can be used to try to cultivate an opening for Tao to enter. And in this podcast, we're going to start our episodes by engaging in these practices in a way very similar to the indigenous people of China at that time. And this is simply to center ourselves and open up our xin, which is translated as heart, but in ancient Chinese indigenous culture, it would have been something more like the total inner experience of someone. So thoughts, the mind, interoception, the emotions, the desire, the awareness, the intentions, that whole inner subjective experience. So not just heart, not just passion or desire or emotion, but all of those things. And so by using these practices, we can cleanse the xin, if you will, to better align with Tao, better center ourselves. So let's begin. Just find yourself in a seated position, and one where you feel supported, by your own body, by the chair that you're on, or wherever. You could lie down if you wish, but this initial one is much better to be in a seated position, at least as far as this first time through. And you want to have solid posture, a supported posture, no slumping over, not getting rigid or stiff, and just straightening the spine, and even imagine, if you will, your head stretching up toward the sky, but not in a strained way, but just as a way of straightening the spine, but still relaxed. And now what we want to do is first just bring our attention to the breath. So just notice the breath. We're not trying to change the breath or force the breath. Just notice it. And what you first might notice is that there's an inhalation and then a pause, an exhalation and then a pause. But there's 4 distinct points in this breath. So what we want to do on the way in, just notice the feeling of that air coming in the body and filling it. And just noticing what the body feels like. And then after the pause, while exhaling, starting at the top of the head, notice any tension in the head and just let that tension drain away down through the body, down through the legs and feet, and into the ground. And notice that with each breath and exhaling and just letting that tension leave. And the next breath, shift your awareness down slightly lower into the neck. And when you put that attention there, you might notice a slight urge to just let that neck relax and just maybe even spontaneously just shift around slightly as that tension is released. And shifting down further into the chest, exhaling, letting that tension go, noticing the pause, inhaling and just noticing the feeling of the breath filling up. And as we exhale, letting all of the tension in our stomach drain. Maybe we've been holding tension in our stomach, tightening it up, letting that go. And the next breath, imagining all of the tension in our arms and hands and fingers, just letting that relax. And drain into the ground. And the next breath, same with our legs and our buttocks. Just let go of any tension there that you're holding. Breathing in, filling up with fresh air. Notice the pause, breathing out, letting go of tension in the knees, calves, feet. And now just noticing the centeredness, noticing the space that's now inside. Noticing that whatever is happening in the moment and the surroundings can just be there without your interference, without you doing anything, without fighting with it. Noticing that if there's any thoughts that are arising, that they can just float. They can just float inside. There's nothing to be done with them. That we can keep pulling air into our bodies. And as we exhale after the pause, let all of the tension that we notice just drain away. And we can continue this practice as long as we want. 5 minutes will usually be sufficient for quite a significant change. I feel quite full of emptiness. There's the paradox of Tao, full of emptiness. I feel quite centered. And I have an energized feeling, but not one that's anxious or intentional, just an energized feeling of connectedness. So now moving into the Dao moment for this episode. I was at a Hakomi retreat in Berkeley, California this weekend. And Hakomi is a form of psychotherapy inspired by Tao, literally founded on Taoist principles of wu wei, or non-interference, non-coercion, nonviolent, letting things organically happen spontaneously, and using the person's body as the source of truth of what needs need to be met, what needs must be fulfilled for this person. Not assuming that we know what someone needs, but that their body can tell them what they need. And so this was a beautiful weekend with lots of beautiful people enjoying practicing an art of psychotherapy rooted in Tao. And one of the most beautiful practices that we did was imagining ourselves back in the mother's womb, and doing that by just lying in a comfortable nest on the ground and letting our bodies move the way that they would have moved in the womb. So curling and uncurling the body, just like the embryo in the womb has limited space, but it can curl in on itself and uncurl and move in sort of this undulating way, or stretch out and playfully shift inside the mother's womb, stretch the legs into the wall of the mother. And through this experience, emotions will just spontaneously begin arising when we get connected back with the memory in our body of what it felt like to be those months inside the mother. And I was surprised at the strength of emotion that spontaneously came up, the spontaneity. The first thought that really cracked open the door was, it's just me and mom. And in that space, there's a protection between the child, the unborn child, the mother, and what will eventually be being thrust into the world. And I could feel that in my body in that exercise, that I just wanted to stay inside the mother, that once I had to enter the world, it would be difficult and challenging, and that the best place to be was in the womb, and that it was only going to get harder. And we can apply that to Tao, to our understanding of Daodejing, particularly chapter 1, where I've mentioned in other episodes, there's a lot of misinterpretation of what that chapter means. And Tao is essentially like being in the mother's womb. And when we take care of our body psychologically, like with the practice that we just did, it's like returning to the womb, returning back to that place of nourishment where, yes, there's still an outside world, but in that moment, we're not dealing with the manifestations. We're just going into the field. And that's the desireless state that's talked about in chapter 1 of Daodejing. There's so many misinterpretations of people who don't really have a depth of understanding of Taoism and its roots in these somatic practices. Daodejing came afterward. The somatic practices came first, and then the writing of Daodejing. So when people just treat it like a philosophical text or poems, they really miss the point. They miss the root of it. So when we do the practice like what we just did, we're really going into the field. We're going to the desireless state. It's not that desire is bad, which that's morality. When you see that in translations, that's Western morality from, our post-Victorian, post-Dark Ages mentality that we project onto things in our Western minds. And that's not what that chapter is saying at all. It's saying we can go into this desireless state full of emptiness, full of just being, And that's where we can see the subtleties of Dao. We can see it working inside of us and our bodies. And Dao fills us in those desireless states. Then there's the focus state. That's the other part of chapter 1, where when you have desire or intention or things to do or are engaging with life in a more active way, that's when you're making contact with the edges, the manifestations of Dao. And it's really a way of saying that Dao is in all of those states, but by participating in these practices, we can go into some deeper waters, if you will, where we're really contacting the abyssal darkness of Dao in our own psychology, in our own bodies, in our own Xin. So that's really important. That's a really important distinction between Dao that has been obscured and modified and turned into something other than the indigenous practice. And that's why we're uncovering Dao here. We're uncovering Dao as the indigenous Chinese people created it. And modern psychotherapy, with all of its research-based, evidence-based practices, confirms that all this stuff is great, and then wants to pretend like Western science discovered it, which is totally untrue. And that's just another type of bias that our society believes that wisdom has a straight line to it, and that we just keep getting more and more wise as human species creates more and more sophisticated civilizations. And what we actually can see through these processes is that a lot of times the so-called sophistication and technological progress, it can cover up a lot of wisdom, and we have to uncover that wisdom by going back to the source rather than pretending like this time is the wisest time or the most enlightened time. So this episode, we're going to focus on chapter 5. And as usual, there's a lot of distortions of the original meaning of this particular chapter. I'm going to try to uncover a meaning closer to what the indigenous people meant, rather than just applying a lot of misperceptions onto an ancient text, because we're so far removed from that time that we can't figure it out. And so we give up by assuming that our ideas about things must be the correct ones. So first I'm going to read my translation of chapter 5 of Daodejing. If you're a new listener or just have forgotten, ianfelton.com, ianfelton.com/podcast. I always post resources there. You'll find posts for these inner workings that we're doing. You'll find the version of Daodejing that I read from in Chinese and some other things. You can always go there to find those resources. So now the translation of chapter 5. Existence isn't partial, treating everything like straw dogs. The sage isn't partial, treating the 100 clans as if straw dogs. The room of all existence, isn't it like a bellows, empty and inexhaustible? Use it, and the more it yields. Many words quickly run dry, not as good as staying in the center. So let's forget about the first part of this chapter, the straw dogs part, for a moment, and just look at the second part about the bellows, and now connect that to the practice that we just did. And you can see how these words make a lot more sense if you imagine someone just did the breathing practice that we did. The bellows. It's inexhaustible. The more you use it, the more it yields. The more that you stay in that breathing practice, taking in nourishment, relaxing tension, and just filling up with emptiness, the more it yields. Many words quickly run dry. If someone came in and just started talking to you and explaining things to you, it interrupts the experience that you're working through in that moment. It ruins the filling up with emptiness. Not as good as staying in the center, not as good as staying in that centered place of just breathing like the bellows, filling up, empty, filling up, emptying. So that connection becomes a lot clearer since we did that practice right before this. Now let's go to the straw dogs part, because how this gets misinterpreted quite often is that the straw dogs is being treated cruelly or with no concern, and that's not what it means at all. Straw dogs in indigenous cultures in China at that time, they were treated quite reverently in ceremonies. I mean, there was a lot of care put into creating these straw dogs, and they served a purpose. They served a very significant purpose, but once that purpose was over, the straw dogs they had their time, and then, of course, they go back to the earth. There was no special treatment of holding these straw dogs and putting them up on an altar, glorifying them beyond that ceremonial purpose where they were quite special. But there was no sentiment before or after, just complete presence with them while they were being used. So it's an image for how the sage treats each person. And this is in contrast to the Confucian way that was arising at the time, where everyone got treated differently depending upon the relationship, and all those relationships were contrived by Confucius. I mean, it was totally manufactured. And so the straw dogs image isn't about saying that nature is cruel and that the sage is cruel and doesn't care about people. It's a contrast against the contrived Confucian way of things, where you treat certain people with more special consideration depending upon what their role is in society. And Taoism doesn't do that. The sage treats each person like a straw dog. They all have, and there's equanimity in all of that. There's no special treatment. So that's very important, that whatever translation you're using, that is made, it's not interpreted in a negative way or in a way that obscures how those straw dogs were used in indigenous culture. And that's where Ren is without partiality. Ren, that's Confucius virtue about humanity. And other chapters in Daodejing get in that basically say, like, when we've fallen from Tao, then that's when humaneness arises, that each deterioration of away from Tao leads to this next contrived thing. Like and then when humaneness is lost, then there's roles. And then when roles are lost, then, the rulers use force. And it's really a way of saying humaneness even is a step down from treating everyone equally, that you shouldn't have when these roles and virtues arise, that's when Tao has been lost. So after acknowledging that the sage is just cultivating this inner state of equanimity through being like the bellows, this inner work of cultivating oneself internally to make room for the presence of Tao. That sort of equanimity inside leads to treating everyone on the outside the same way, with the same concern. So those are the important terms from this chapter. Now and we've heard my translation, I'm going to go to some of the other popular translations and read from them. Of course, I'm going to be critical if there's something that I feel has missed the mark, that has obscured Tao rather than uncovered it. So that's kind of the purpose of this, to help you to see when a translation has obscured the indigenous intent of this practice. Tea break. So, Hall and Ames, the heavens and the earth are not partial to institutionalized morality. They take things and treat them all as straw dogs. Sages, too, are not partial to institutionalized morality. They treat the common people as straw dogs. The space between the heavens and the earth, isn't it just like a bellows? Even though empty, it is not vacuous. Pump in and more comes out. Is it better to safeguard what you have within than to learn a great deal that so often goes nowhere? So this is where I love that Hall and Ames have been so committed to the philosophical depth of the indigenous meanings and intent. My only complaint with sometimes it loses the poetry, right? Like when you start saying institutionalized morality, they're wanting very hard to make it clear to the reader what this chapter means, and that's wonderful, and I greatly appreciate that. But in the process, some of the poetry does get lost. But I owe them a great deal of credit in helping me uncover Tao. But in my translation, I do try to maintain more of the poetry of the original writing, because that's why we love this text, the simplicity of it and the depth that it has. Daodejing from Stephen Mitchell. The Tao doesn't take sides. It gives birth to both good and evil. I don't like that at all. It's immediately interjecting. It just feels very both of those words are a lot more judgmental and loaded with a lot of Western concepts. The master doesn't take sides. She welcomes both saints and sinners. I mean, wow. Yeah. I mean, this is where it's poetic, but it's this isn't a translation so much as it's someone who has created a reinterpretation, and there's nothing about saints and sinners in indigenous Chinese culture from the time that these practices and texts arose. So I'm going to hit this one pretty hard. I'm not going to read any more of this one. And now we have Ursula K. Le Guin's Daodejing. She titles this chapter "Useful Emptiness." I love the title. I think it truly captures the intent of this chapter, especially how we connected to the practice, that useful emptiness, filling up with emptiness, and how much nourishment we gain from that practice. So let's see how she translates it. Heaven and earth are humane. To them, the 10,000 things are straw dogs. Wise souls are humane. To them, the 100 families are straw dogs. I'm going to stop there because why? So, really good job with talking about humane, because that's the Confucian idea. She sticks to the original Chinese concepts of 10,000 things, which is a metaphor for all the manifestations of things, and sticks to the Chinese straw dogs metaphor, which is great. But she translates shengren, which is typically we say the sage. So wise souls, that has a lot of value judgments, and it also gets into transcendentalness, which Taoism is about. It's immanent. It's in this moment. It's present, fully embodied in a human body with meat and flesh and everything else. There's nothing about souls in this chapter. And wise, the sage isn't about wisdom. It's about someone who does these practices and maintains a state of equanimity, that presence that's there, that doesn't interfere with things. I mean, it might look like wisdom, but wisdom is more about, the Western views of knowledge and how to apply it in concepts. And wise has this mental association with it. And though you combine the two, wise souls, now we've moved really far away from the concept of the sage or what the sage is. And the sage is just a human being who practices these practices and shows up in the world in a particular way. Once you start thinking that you're wise, you've really gone far off track. So I'm going to stop with this reading, and we'll do one more. So this is Lao Tzu's Daodejing by Red Pine. Heaven and earth are heartless. Okay, I'm gonna stop. I've talked about all of the loaded misinterpretations of what the straw dogs mean. Heartless, I mean, that's where it starts getting into cruelty, and it has this it made my body feel really tense and upset. And it's going to go on and talk about, the sage in the same way. And that it's just not what the spirit of this chapter is. So I'm reading from these not to criticize the authors and some of them are really good, right? Like I love the title of Ursula K. Le Guin's Useful Emptiness. Like that's a beautiful title for the chapter. So there are some nice things in it or accurate things in it that keeps the spirit. But then there's some partial uncoverings that start to obscure the essence of the indigenous culture that created these practices and these poems. So that's my agenda, isn't to criticize just for the sake of criticizing, but because these are out there in the world and they're so popular, I mean, highly rated translations, but do cover up some important things about Tao and about the indigenous cultures that these arose in. So that's my purpose, is to help us uncover Tao. It's been covered. It's like archaeology, where to get the beautiful fossil that's been covered up with all of this dirt and pressure and compressed and compressed and compressed, we have to do a lot of work to uncover that. And we have to uncover all of the cultural history that's been piled on top of this indigenous culture since people practice it and it arose. And I will go back to now the psychological integration piece of the podcast, that so many modern psychotherapy practices are centered on these exact practices that come from indigenous Chinese people. ACT, acceptance and commitment therapy, third wave cognitive behavioral therapy. It's completely rooted in, I wouldn't say rooted. I think Hakomi literally says we are rooted in Taoism. There's no beating around the bush. That's why I practice Hakomi, because it says we are Taoist. It doesn't mean I agree with everything that Hakomi does as it's taught, because I think similarly we can probably find some ways where Tao might be getting covered up. I can't point to anything in this particular moment. I'm not trying to equate the two, that Hakomi is exactly what I'm doing with this podcast or my own psychotherapy practice. I present mine as I'm a psychotherapist and I'm a Taoist, and my particular way of doing psychotherapy is rooted in Tao as I understand it. I don't claim to have the exact mindset of the indigenous sages in China in the centuries leading up to these practices being written down. But I can tell you that many evidence-based psychotherapies are saying, yep, this stuff works. This stuff creates psychological health. Here's the studies we did, so on and so forth. So for the integration for this week, go back to the beginning of the episode and sit with that practice and see how long you can do it. If you have a half an hour, do it for a half an hour, and just notice what changes inside of you when you do it. Notice what changes in your body, in your mindset, and then notice what happens when you leave that practice and start entering back into the world. And pay attention to that. Pay attention to the difference. And note that at any time, you can return to that aspect of Tao. Well, I appreciate you all who have listened, and the reboot is growing in popularity and lots more people are tuning in. If you like the podcast, be sure to follow it. Be sure to share the links with anyone else that you think could benefit from it. I do want to sign off still by reading the original Chinese. I'm moving it to the end because since most listeners don't speak Chinese, I don't want to lose people by doing it early on. But I think the best way to honor the text is to still say goodbye by reading the original Chinese. So I'm going to do that now and then say goodbye. Chapter 5. 天地不仁，以万物为刍狗；上人不仁，以百姓为刍狗。天地之间，岂有橐越乎？虚而不屈，动而欲出。多言数穷，不如守中。